Welcome, everyone. We're delighted that you could join us today for Working Ethics into the Conversation webinar series. I'm Rosalind Byrne. Before beginning today's session and introducing our guest speaker and discussant, I'd like to point out a few process items. First, you're all on mute and will remain so throughout the entire webinar. Any communication you wish to have with our speaker or our discussant will come through only in writing. Please post all of your questions in the Q&A. That button can be found at the bottom of your screen. We will attempt to acknowledge and read all of your questions out loud so that they can be addressed, but we can't guarantee that all of them will be read. The Online Ethics Center, also known as the OEC, is a project of the National Academy of Engineering in partnership with the Center for Biology and Society at Arizona State University and the Illinois Institute of Technology's Center for the Study of Ethics in the Professions. The Working Ethics into the Conversation webinar series is a collaboration with the Engineering Ethics Division of the American Society of Engineering Education. We thank the National Science Foundation for their support of the Online Ethics Center. The OEC provides a host of ethics resources for faculty, students, and practitioners of engineering and science. It will soon be host to a forum on teaching ethics for STEM faculty new to teaching ethics and wanting to explore, share, and reflect inside the community about ethics instruction in engineering and science. Today's presentation features Dr. Becky Bates, professor and chair in the Department of Integrated Engineering at Minnesota State University, Mankato. Dr. Bates will speak on teaching ethics in the context of ABET requirements. She is joined by our discussant, Dr. Stephen Starrett, Dean of the School of Engineering and Engineering Technology and Professor of Civil Engineering at LeTourneau University. Thank you both for being here. Welcome, welcome. Becky, introduce yourself, please, to our participants.
Thank you, Roz. I'm really happy to be here today talking about ethics education and engineering. I'm happy to be in my home and know that pretty much everybody's at home right now. So thank you for joining us. My experience as a department chair is working with project-based engineering programs. I've taken 2 programs through 2 ABET accreditation cycles. The first, the initial ones, and then a second one to get us in line with the rest of the engineering programs in our college. And it was an interesting challenge getting innovative programs accredited. So I'm happy to talk about some of that experience here.
Excellent, excellent. Steve, hi there. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for, yes. Thank you for involving me in this webinar today. I'm in my home here in Longview, Texas. I've had a long interest in engineering ethics going all the way back to my undergraduate days at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. I took Dr. Paul Munger's class on engineering ethics, and that was shortly after the Hyatt Regency disaster. So that would have been in the late 80s that I took that class. And ever since then, I've been interested in engineering ethics. I've really enjoyed working with Dr. Bates on our discussions previously, and I really look forward to learning from her knowledge today. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. So let's begin.
Okay. So as with, I think, just about everybody, we're all really developing our skills with Zoom. So, so I've just shared everything with you. So the title of this topic is Teaching Ethics in the Context of ABET Requirements, which means we should really talk about what is the ABET context. So the old version is that we had to meet an outcome, a student graduation outcome, that students would have an understanding of professional and ethical responsibility. With the new ABET criteria, this has changed, and I want to look at this kind of broader context and work with the updated criteria. So the first place where we would think about this is when we're thinking about what do faculty do. So this is Criterion 6 of the accreditation process. And the key thing here is teaching effectiveness. There's some other things here that connect, I believe, to social justice and inclusion, this idea of diversity of backgrounds and what kinds of engineering experience people have. But really the key issue here is how do we do this effectively, and what are some methods that we can do that help faculty support ethics education. This really connects to assessment, because if we don't know what's working, it's really hard to show that we're being effective teachers. The next thing is thinking about Criterion 3. Ethics is no longer a single standalone outcome. It's really embedded across other student outcomes. And this kind of integrated, embedded approach to thinking about ethics is something that we need to think about when we're teaching and when we're assessing things. So it shows up now in Criterion, in the outcomes 2, 4, and 5, as we think about things like how do we consider public health, safety, and welfare, as well as other factors. And then there is one that focuses on ethical and professional responsibility, but it's not just understanding it, it's the ability to make informed judgments, to consider the impact, and to look at societal contexts. And all of these contexts that might be affected by our engineering designs or might affect how we do design. And then another one that's important that I don't think everybody thinks of as an ethical outcome, but I think is really crucial, is the idea of how do we, in working together, think about creating a collaborative and inclusive environment. And this is something that really says, connects to the idea of diversity. What kinds of engineering designs are we making? And how do we support students in their ability to actively create this kind of environment? So those are the student outcomes. What can the students do when they graduate? Then we have Criterion 5, which is looking at the overall curriculum. And the idea of ethics education is embedded in here as well. When we think about design and designing solutions that meet all of these criteria, we have both the preparation in the broad educational component, which could mean saying, hey, we want you taking philosophy classes. We want you working with philosophers to learn about ethical decision processes. And then we want you to come into our engineering classes with that knowledge and then apply it. When we also think about curriculum, there is a capstone design requirement for engineering programs. And this ability to apply multiple constraints, some of which are specifically ethical, is another place where we think about it in this, in the curricular area. So then we have, so this is the context. So now we start thinking about, well, if I'm caring about ABET, then I'm caring about accreditation, which means I need to have evidence that shows how is my program meeting these criteria? How are my students meeting their outcomes? So we have to talk about assessment a little bit. And there's two main kinds of assessment. We have formative assessment, which is looking at things like how do we know when or whether a student is prepared to make the decisions, which is part of an outcome, in their senior design experience. If they're not kind of building these muscles as they go through a 4-year program, and we just say, okay, you're a senior and you're doing a capstone design, make good decisions. The formative assessment lets us know as we're moving towards that if students are actually going to be able to do it. When we go to, yeah.
How does this relate to some of the ABET language that talks about direct assessment and indirect ways to assess?
So I'm not sure I'm going to answer this completely, so I might need your help. But when we think about direct assessment, is there something that we can directly measure based on student performance? Or is there something that we can observe generally? So both of those types of assessment are going to help us do our formative assessment.
Right.
So if I'm working with students and I see that they're struggling to make decisions, that's really indirect. I don't have something that I can necessarily give a number score to, but it is going to affect how I maybe extend an assignment or clarify something or ask them to do something more, or say, maybe in my first year course, I should try something else. So all of this is going to help me make good decisions about what I do next time in an earlier course, or how I support students right now as they're moving forward.
Thank you.
Okay, if that answers your question, good.
Yes, thanks.
Then we move to summative feedback, which is really what we're doing when we are going through the ABET accreditation process. When we are saying, okay, the evaluator should come, I'm writing the self-study, I'm saying we have done this, we've met our 6-year cycle, and we're doing this. We're also doing this when we say a student is ready to graduate. So this summative feedback is what happens towards the end of a space. Are we actually, are the things that we could measure, how are they matching up to what our expectations were? We expected our students to graduate with these skills. Are they actually graduating with these skills? And that's the summative feedback that lets us say an overall program is working. For individual students, and often for our programs, this really comes out in the culminating design experience. What are we doing in this final space? Did they do enough building up to a capstone design that they can meet all of the expectations of a creative design that meets all of the constraints? So in these two types of feedback, there's really a philosophical framework that connects to our idea of assessment. So what ABET is doing is really giving us outcomes-based assessment, which requires summative feedback. But if we're working with students and we're trying to improve our programs, ABET also strongly encourages a philosophy of continuous improvement. We aren't just going to improve every 4 years. We can't wait for 4 years to decide if everything is going fine. So this is where we need the formative feedback. We need regular summative feedback as students are graduating. We can't just wait until the 4th year to see if that's enough. So there's a lot of different approaches to assessment. I'm going to give a couple of examples. But when we start, if we are doing this outcomes-based philosophy approach to assessment, we would start with the graduation outcomes. So this is where we want to measure and evaluate the program's results against their intended results. So if we go back, we have language of what students should be able to do and perhaps how they should be able to do it. Is that actually happening? So this is the starting point of thinking about what it is we want to assess, but then we might move to the course objectives, which is what individual faculty are actually able to control.
May I interrupt you, Becky? Someone's put a note in the chat room, formative is, however, not required by ABET. Did you want to address that comment?
Sure. I'm just thinking of all the things I require my students to do and all the things that they could do to actually do it well. And so I might not grade all of the steps that it takes to get to a final project, but I want their final project to be done well. Mm-hmm. And so I would think of it kind of like that the formative assessment, while not required, is going to be really helpful. Because if you wait until the end and do the summative assessment, you might find that it's not working. Mm-hmm.
Thank
you.
So
what do you do?
Thank you.
And this is why individual faculty really have a strong part to play here, because we're often we're working with our individual courses. We're not necessarily thinking about programmatic issues. We're thinking about, can students get through this course well? And the course objectives should be connected to the graduation outcomes. But what we can influence on a regular basis and working with students is really what's going on in our individual classes. So when we think about the assessment here, we want to have show that within a time frame, with the available resources, what specific result can I achieve? And so when we think about course objectives, they should be measurable, realistic, and observable. And this is where I want to point out that I bet these are changing for everybody right now. That as, I don't know a single university or college that isn't going online right now. And the idea of what's measurable shifts when we aren't in a room with our students 3 days a week. What's realistic here when our brains are the cognitive load on our brains is really different right now. And what might be observable is really different. And so as we're, and my university hasn't gone back to classes yet, we start again on Monday. We're really thinking about what's realistic, what's measurable, what can we do, especially in a project-based program, that's still going to let us think about how we get students to the graduation outcomes. Our course objectives are shifting. We still have this ultimate goal of graduation outcomes, but what we can do in this space is changing. Fortunately for engineers, I can kind of sell this as this is now a very realistic challenge. Our constraints are changing as engineers, you know, engineers in industry are having all of their constraints change as well. What we can do in manufacturing is changing. So how our students adapt, how our faculty adapt is going to change as well. I had a student this morning asking if I'd prepared ahead of time for a pandemic. And I had to say no. We were ahead of the curve because we talked about possible changes on March 4th in a department meeting. We thought we were totally ahead of the game. And within 5 days, everything was changing. So this idea of supporting our students and each other in thinking about what do we need to do to get from our courses to our graduation outcomes is, well, it's an amazing engineering challenge. It's also very realistic, but it's also something where we need to think about what is in this time, in this space, actually realistic. And what can we do to get close, still be moving towards these outcomes, especially for our seniors who are graduating.
I have another question that's just come in. Would you like to hear it?
Sure.
All right. Neil Rothman asks, do you, I think, have a perspective on what evidence ABET would want to see around changes specifically made this year to courses, assignments, assessments, etc.?
I do not have any insight. I am not sure, but I would gather the evidence, because I think that if you think about the spirit of ABET accreditation in its best, most glowing terms, it really is about continuous improvement and reacting, getting the information that you have and reacting to it and keeping the evidence of how you did it and then looking at whether or not it worked. And I am pretty sure none of us is going to do this perfectly in the next 8 weeks. So thinking about what did we do? Are we making good attempts? And then did it work? Because also right now there's uncertainty. My university is only doing online courses for the summer. And there's some conversation that our fall might be online as well. And so we're going to have opportunities to improve. And so what we're really doing now is the starting point. I did look on the ABET website today, and there's not really guidance about how things might change. But I think if we just keep gathering the evidence, especially if you're in a cycle right now where things are coming up soon, gather the evidence, and we're all dealing with this very real world situation right now. So I don't have any specific insight except to show that you are in the process.
Thank you.
Okay, so then the question is, well, wait, what do we really assess? And what are the things that are going to let us show that students are meeting these outcomes? And so at the program level, the question might be, what performance indicators would show a student has met the outcomes over the course of the program? And so if you look at an individual student, again, if they're graded on if these are assignments and they're graded at a particular level, then you can say this individual student should graduate. But what I might want to look at is how is the program changing? Are students generally doing more of this or doing it better? One thing that we see when we look at this, both for students in our program, in my program, is we might look at comparisons. So are students doing a good job working on time management? We might want to see Gantt charts at the beginning of a semester project and at the end of a semester project. How have things changed for the students? And so responses to ethical assignments and in a sophomore year, comparing that to a senior year, could show things like, are they taking into account more stakeholders or a variety of stakeholders? In a specific class then, what activities or results would clearly show that students have met objectives? And it's going to be a lot easier if there's a connection between things you use to look at program outcomes and things you use to meet the course objectives. So in my program, they're small. And so one approach that we use is to work with student portfolios. And we give students the performance indicators. So I'll give you some example performance indicators in the next slides. But we provide these indicators to students and talk about, okay, here's all the stuff you're doing for your work in your classes, in the program. Which artifacts could you use to demonstrate your performance in these particular areas to show that you're meeting these indicators? And then the students actually select their most meaningful evidence, what they would call their best works. So they're creating a best works portfolio. So some of the performance indicators that we use that connect to the outcomes that I showed earlier might be connected to the design. So can the student critically judge design solution effectiveness based on the project requirements? The project requirements, if they have ethical aspects, if they have societal aspects, those are the project requirements. So how are the students evaluating this? They should be discussing ethical implications of their design. What kind of evidence would they have of this? It could be, so if I ask them to do this in an online conversation space, well, then they have the documents. If they write up notes of conversations they have with their teammates, then they would have evidence here. We have other types of performance indicators, and I will share these slides if these are helpful. We ask students to write professional development plans. This is something that a lot of engineers have to do anyway, so we ask them to do this. And they should be in their professional development plan thinking about how they interact with others. And what does that mean to create a learning environment, an engineering workplace that's inclusive. So students gather evidence of this. Sometimes the evidence is a faculty member noticed I was doing this. So we also, as faculty members, in one of my programs, students are given regular awards, just recognizing, hey, you have done a great job with your behavior. It's sometimes my swearing is a challenge for professional behavior, and people have noticed when I've done a better job of cleaning up my language. I have had faculty encourage me to do this. And so you can create an environment where people support this development. But if somebody notices that, then that can become evidence as well.
Steve, did you have,
Dr.
Steve
Bates?
had his hand up.
Yeah, Dr. Bates, I wonder what your thoughts are if professors need to be careful when they're creating these performance indicators to be too narrow compared to the student outcome as far as the ABET, the real in the weeds ABET work.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts about making sure that the performance indicator doesn't cause a challenge with an ABET evaluator saying, well, yeah, that's a nice performance indicator, but you didn't really pursue the entire student outcome?
Right, we have, so these are the performance indicators for 3 outcomes, and they aren't quite all of them. So we have multiple indicators per outcome that let us address the different facets. So if they didn't think we were addressing one component, then that would be feedback that we would happily happily take into our continuous improvement process. I think, and that's something we talk about with our students as well. Are you showing this? How are you showing this? And sometimes students have said, I show this better if I can do it like this. Great. That could become a new performance indicator. It could become a substitute performance indicator. We ask students to give their evidence and say why this evidence meets this. So there's also a closing of the loop. That's actually then that kind of work of saying, here is how I am a good engineer, becomes really important for their ability to defend it later and for them to know what kind of engineer they are. Okay, so then another approach that I find really valuable is using reflection. And there's a lot of additional research on reflection right now and how this is valuable for student learning. So I'm just going to start with a sample reflection assignment. It's 4 questions. Describe the learning activity, describe the takeaway knowledge. So basically, give me a 1 sentence, what do you get out of this? Explain how the learning will be used in your design project or your future as a student or an engineer. And then identify further questions that you would like to answer or further learning you would like to do as a result of this learning. We have 2 forms of this assignment. One's really short, almost like a haiku. Answer these 4 questions in no more than 40 words. The other one lets you're encouraged to be brief, but lets you go longer to really kind of work on some of the details. Sometimes the further questions, when students aren't sure why they had to do something, was, why did I have to learn this? That's actually not an unreasonable question to ask, because if they actually start exploring it, they might come up with a reason why this was potentially useful information. So the idea of reflection is that students actually think about what they're learning again. It can reinforce their learning and it can help them construct meaning from this. So as an exercise, this is really valuable for students, but we can also use this as an assessment tool, and especially once we think about it kind of programmatically. So I will give some examples of looking at reflections. There's a lot of different learning approaches when we think about ways to learn about ethics. And I kind of have like a hierarchy of this that starts off small, that we want to think about how do we build these decision-making muscles? If we want them making good decisions in the senior year, what are we doing in their foundation, freshman, first and second year classes to build those muscles? So this might be thinking about microethics and personal responsibility. They may or may not be engineering questions. They might be, how do you treat people in your current social space? How do you make economic decisions? So it could be small things that then can expand to larger things. There's a lot of good examples of working with codes of ethics and case studies. So this is really now starting to connect your ethical decision making to what kinds of decisions are made in the profession. My favorite, and one I'll give you a more close example about, is finding broader connections to society and to personal experiences through fiction. And then, of course, there's the space in capstone design, where there's an expectation that you might discuss the ethical implications of your design. You might be thinking about the whole life cycle of a project to think about sustainability and environmental ethics. So a quick fiction example, we try to, every 5 or 6 semesters in programs where students are in the program for 4 semesters. So most students will have 1 semester where our common read is actually a fictional read. So every semester we ask students to read a book. A couple of years ago, we used a book called Prey by Michael Crichton, and it's a science fiction work where there's a world in where a company has advanced in the fields of computer science and nanoscale engineering sufficiently enough to generate swarms of artificially intelligent nanobots that are maybe starting to achieve consciousness. So this was a book that we thought would touch on contemporary issues as well as ethics. There was 3 specific reflection assignments over the semester. And so at the course assessment level, we could say, well, are students addressing the concepts? Are they making connections between contemporary issues and ethical decision-making? But then at a program assessment level, how is the group meeting the program outcomes? And then across all of our approaches, so we might do this fictional work once every few semesters, but we're also doing things like case studies and connecting this to our project work. So across all of these approaches to learning experiences, are we meeting our expectations as a program? So what we did was look at themes across these reflections for this particular example of working with Prey. The student engineers were positive about the experience. They liked using fiction to grapple with potential engineering experiences they might have. They saw the main character as an ethical exemplar who was making decisions that they thought were interesting. And the student views were really colored by their own personal experiences. So this was a person who was, as a man, lost his job while his wife kept her job. So he was being a stay-at-home dad. Some people really picked up on the roles and the connection of caretaker roles in society as an ethical question. Others looked at his decision-making in thinking about the technical issues and how he might dive into the problem as an ethical exemplar. The students saw that they could see connections between this work of fiction and what could potentially happen in a real-world case. So they were extrapolating to, well, in the future, I could do this kind of thing. And that connected to the next theme where they, in their writing and their reflection on it, because they could make these connections between what could happen, they would say, I would do this. In the future, I could do this. And we're thinking about what kinds of actions they would take that were more embedded in a richer conversation than just, well, I would never take money. I would never accept a bribe. This lets them get into some of the meat because they're also connected to the emotional experience of the character. And then as an anti-theme, we were really impressed with how the range of ethical perspectives that were presented in the reflections. And this is really a case where we don't want our students to have the same perspectives and opinions. We want them to develop their capacity to do ethical thinking, but we aren't telling them what to think. And so this development, this expression of the diversity was really important.
Becky.
Dr. Becky?
Yep.
Someone's just
Yes,
saying.
I wonder how.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Steve.
I just wonder. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. But yes, Dr. Bates, I wonder how you've learned to best facilitate discussion and peer-to-peer learning. Students have different viewpoints that may be difficult for some to grapple with someone else having a different viewpoint of their own, and how have you best managed that?
Yeah, we've had some awesome students who are just so willing to be out on the edge, on the far end of what might be popular, and I'd say that in my program, there's a couple of us that work with this and even work within the same books, and I am not as good at hiding my perspective. So I'll say, you know, but I'll also be very upfront about, you do not have to have the same perspective as me. And this is valuable, and I'm going to learn from you. And if you explain something to me, I am going to do my best to understand it and connect my thinking to your thinking. And so I'm modeling then how we might deal with differences. Another professor is really good at not exposing his personal beliefs and drawing out the student contrasts. And I think both of those approaches can be really valuable. If I go in there and say my way is the best way and it's the right way and everybody has to think like me, that's not going to help any discussion. But the fact that we have conversation, and the fact that we also let students write about this, and the reflections come in after the conversations, lets us support students who might not want to talk in a large group discussion. We also do small group discussions. So students have an opportunity to talk in groups of 3 or 4, where it might be easier for their opinions to be expressed. And then when we report out to the large group, you're not necessarily reporting what you think. You might be reporting what your group is thinking.
Yep. Thank you. Very good.
Yeah. Rosalind?
There are 3 questions in the queue. Are you ready?
Sure.
One from Edward Glore asks, Becky, are these lesson plans available anywhere? I really love this approach.
We'll make them available. We were working on getting things set up to go on to the Online Ethics Center, and then we had to put all of our other courses online. So our plan is to actually have some of these really available. I have 2 papers that are going to be in ASCE this summer, I assume. We'll see how the reviews go. But one is looking specifically at this. Another is looking at using short stories, and there's some really good using short stories in engineering classes with different examples of short stories for different topics. And we have some, I think, helpful guidelines for discussion, as well as questions that you can ask students that get them into thinking about the stories in an ethical decision-making process. So I will, before I share any slides, I'll make sure that paper title is in the slides as well. And then happily make preprints available if people want. And then we'll be getting things up on the Online Ethics Center.
And I think as a follow-up, Alexis Norden says, I like the fiction idea. Are there other examples, books or short stories you can point us to in addition to Pray?
Yeah, yes, I'm really happy to. And the answer kind of is, it depends. My favorite class to teach in the universe is AI and sci-fi. So I'm figuring out how to put that online this summer. And we use movies and books for that. There are some really good short stories. Thinking about autonomous vehicles, there's a story called Stut. And there's links to that in the paper that we have. There's we did Neuromancer as a fictional work last fall. The faculty don't really like it. The students voted on which books they would read, and then we go along with what the students vote. We used 1-sentence descriptions of the books for them to decide on, so that they wouldn't just choose a short book or a popular book, but one that actually felt interesting to them. And we ended up with Neuromancer. So there's a lot going on in older works of fiction. Yeah, I can provide other lists as well, but those are a few.
I've certainly used Gattaca a lot in my teaching.
Yeah.
Students really respond to that. So Neil Rothman asks, how do you approach faculty who may not feel well qualified to handle ethics or ethical issues in their courses? Perhaps more broadly, do you include ethics in all courses or just a select subset of courses in the program?
Our programs are a little unusual in that we have the projects are overarching, and so we have a seminar class with professionalism credits that every student in the program is in. So if we do this kind of common read in the seminar, then every student in our program is having that experience. So we don't have to put it into individual classes, but we do expect it then in their design, professionalism, and seminar credits. I would encourage faculty to try. Just try one of those short stories. There are some short stories that only take 10 minutes to read. And one conversation, especially if a short story is directly connected to transportation or construction or AI, something that connects to your class in some way, one class period to help students connect the technical content that you are probably really passionate about and care about their learning, and connect that to other aspects of how they might use it in the future. It doesn't have to go perfectly. It's okay. It's okay if the students are like, why are you making me do this? You can say, because I think it's valuable. And I think some of you might enjoy it. And fiction is a way that for some students, we can really draw them in to thinking more deeply even about the technical content. So I had students with Prey trying to figure out, like, wait, what's going on with nanotech? How much of this is actually possible? What is the state of the art? So it wasn't just pulling them into thinking about the ethical issues or the contemporary issues. It was also thinking about the technical issues. So, so there are resources out there about ways to support students in discussion about this. I wouldn't push this on a faculty member that has no interest in it. Because a lot of this is, if we find this valuable, our students might find it valuable. So how can we support people that maybe enjoy reading or enjoy watching shows that connect to this? That this is a way to connect your technical learning to the kinds of ethical learning that is required in an ABET context, and can make our students stronger engineers in the future.
And I hope once the Online Ethics Center forum for faculty new to teaching ethics is up and running, I hope it's going to be providing conversation opportunities and supportive resources for faculty who are new to teaching ethics, as this person seems to be. It seems we've moved into the Q&A section. Perhaps you'd like to wrap up first, but there are now 4 more questions in the queue. So tell me how you'd like to proceed.
Well, I'll just, I have one more slide, which is just, I want to encourage people to think about the multiple ways that ethical issues and ethical thinking are embedded in all of these assessment expectations, that it's no longer just one thing that we can tick a box on. It is integrated. And so a way to approach meeting these integrated expectations might be to do more integration in how we teach it.
Thank you. So actually now there are 7 questions in the queue.
Okay.
Stephanie Bird asks, do you have a set of questions that are designed to focus student discussions on the primary ethical issues you see?
In a story, in particular stories, yeah. So we do have some examples of things, but you can also ask really general questions, like even those reflection questions, and to bring them up. The students are not living in a vacuum, and they see problematic things, and they want to dive into these. So sometimes I start conversations about this with, what did you think? Mm-hmm. people will say, yeah, I hated this part. Why were they doing this? Yeah, why were they doing that? And then you can draw out, well, where was a decision made, or was no decision made? And so sometimes it's as easy as just starting with, what do you think?
Amy Rush asks, I teach engineering ethics online many years through a philosophy department in a one-term course. Is there a way I can incorporate some of this in my class?
Sure. and we would like your expertise in doing all of this kind of thinking in an online space. That would be really helpful for us as well. I think that when thinking about what kinds of material, so fiction, I'm kind of assuming we're still thinking about fiction here. Making videos available. There's a couple of Star Trek: The Next Generation videos that I use in my classes that are like a single episode. So it might be like watching 45 minutes of television, and then you can ask specific questions about that connect to, you know, what is the value of a human or of a life or of sentience? How do we think about that in these kinds of spaces? So there's an episode called The Measure of a Man, and the question is whether Data, the android, should be turned off or not, if he doesn't want to be turned off. So there's things like that you could bring in, and then do in an online setting, do the kind of the typical conversations that you might have in an online setting. Ask students to write about it, ask students to respond to others' writing. I think that in some ways that's really straightforward.
Natasha asked, can you please repeat the name of the short story about the autonomous vehicles?
STET, S-T-E-T. And I'm trying to think of the name of the author, and my screens are totally covered with slides right now, so I can't look it up. But it's STET, like the editing command, STET.
David Wilder reminds us that the NSPE has many case studies, real-life stories of ethical issues. Many of those are linked on our online ethics site as well, where we have many online actual cases.
Yeah. And those we actually used those this semester, and it had students work with the case studies and the NSPE Code of Ethics, and ask the students to figure out which parts of the code directly applied to that particular case. So in the decision making, in the evaluation of those cases, what would have been guiding the decision makers?
And by the way, thank you. Someone answers that STET is by Sarah Galley.
Thank you.
All right. So Stephanie Bird also comments, some episodes of Star Trek, especially Next Generation, can be very effective to raise issues, and Measure of a Man is one of those. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Dayon Kim, thank you very much for sharing how you deal with diverse range of ethical perspectives in your class. I am also curious if you have any idea on teaching how to deal with such different perspectives in collaborative decision-making process, when engineers have to reach a conclusion beyond acknowledging different perspectives.
Mm-hmm. And so in another part of my life, I'm a figure skating judge, and and there's different, wow. And we all come up with our own ratings of what the skaters are doing. And then there's kind of a mathematical process of how they get combined. So we all have our different views, but then there is kind of a nice averaging that says, okay, here's a consensus of the rankings of the options. So that's kind of one possibility, making sure that things are heard, that options are discussed. I think that an important thing is to make sure that all all the possible options are out there. And that's where often the different viewpoints come into play. That it's not just, you know, vote for the corporations or vote for the workers. It might be somebody else saying, wait, what about the birds? Is that even an option here? And so when we have really diverse viewpoints, making sure that the complexity of the viewpoints is actually acknowledged, that it might not just be a polemic. And so then that can be also a space where common ground might be found.
Dave Wilder comments, FYI, many states are now requiring CEUs in engineering ethics for renewing PE licenses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be cool if we could do that renewal through like book clubs?
Mm. And speaking of book club, in the chat, Joe Herkert commented, useful fiction does not have to be science fiction. See
Yes.
Homer Faber by Max Frisch. Okay, it might be Frisch. And then finally, the last question in the queue, is there a consolidated list of these resources and questions, e.g. Star Trek? I want to keep turning people back to the Online Ethics Center, and the newest page there has a link called Teaching Ethics, and we will be populating that with such things. But Becky, what would you like to say to that question?
So I haven't taught my AI and sci-fi class, so obviously that is towards science fiction, but because I'm going to be teaching it in the summer, I will happily share my materials as I revise them and make them available. And I know that I can push them to the Online Ethics Center. This sounds like a big blatant plug, but I think that's where we can go with it. As with everybody right now, I'm a little overwhelmed with just getting ready for classes on Monday, but this is the kind of thing I'm really happy to share. And there's some collections of things. In the computer science education community, we've been doing a common read for the last like 6 years that has included a work of fiction, but also works of nonfiction and short stories. And I'm really happy to share that list of books. I have that one. And those are books that are a little more geared towards computer science, but a lot of them are looking at things that broadly affect society and how engineers use data. So thinking about how algorithms that we might be implementing in electronic devices might affect social justice.
Hmm. And do note in the chat now, there is a link to the online ethics field on teaching ethics. We will be populating that with such materials as Becky is offering to contribute. There are 2 more questions in the queue. One says, thank you for your talk. I am a graduate researcher. I work on integrating ethics in first-year computing courses.
Nice.
What are some of the themes, implications, etc., that an instructor in computing can learn from your experience that might not be engineering?
Yeah. So I'm a figure skating judge. I'm a department chair, but I also teach computer science classes. So I'm feeling like I can answer this question. I talk a lot about data and the data that we use for making decisions in computer science. So the algorithms that we use, we often think of them as objective reality. But all of those algorithms and processes are typically informed by the data that we use. So how do we think about the data we collect? Does it actually match what's truly out there? So working with, in a 200 level class this semester, looking at it's an intro to AI class, we're talking a lot about data and a lot about how does that reflect our values? How does that reflect our experiences? And what happens when For example, when you develop image processing approaches that only use pink faces, you get really good algorithms, really good systems that recognize pink faces. And when you have different colors, it becomes harder. The algorithms don't work as well, but we've validated these algorithms to work at 97% accuracy. But then you put them out into a real world where the test data didn't match the real world and they stop working. So these are things that students can understand and students experience. Even the sensors for hand washing, you can't always get them to turn on. And some people, depending on the color of their skin, have different experiences with this. So this is something that we can talk about in computer science, we can talk about in electrical engineering. How do we tune things? To what are we tuning, and for whom are we developing our algorithms? For whom are we doing our engineering design? If that can be expanded, then I think our students will have a better career experience.
There's another question. There are two. How can engineers influence decision makers on ethical, fact-based considerations?
This is an awesome question, because what we're doing is asking our engineers to be citizens and to use all the powers of advocacy that we have. And I think that this is something that we don't think about. We don't think about the ways that we can really have powerful effects, and doing the things that we could learn from people who are social justice advocates, for people that do participate more actively in political processes, whether that's running for an office or writing letters to the editor all the time, or actively protesting, or being available as a consultant. Realizing that we can have an impact in these spaces, and realizing that we need to develop our communication abilities as well, so that we can go into these spaces, express what we know to be scientifically valid in such a way that people might actually accept it. So this means working with people who study communication. This means working with people who study social influence. This means learning from people who are the wonderful rabble-rousers that make the quieter voices heard. So I think we should make these possibilities open to our students. Every election day, I make sure I vote. So I have my little "I voted" sticker on all day long in classes. And modeling that, suggesting ways that students can be part of that, connecting the entire experience of being human, being a citizen, to being an engineer. I think that's the starting point.
There are, there's a comment and a question by the same person in the queue, which I'd like to read, but leave it more as a rhetorical question, and then turn to you, Becky and Steve, for closing remarks. The comment is, consider the ethical implications of Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, Seeking a Human Future in a New Frontier. I've got it, it's about that thick. It's amazing. And the same person asked, and let's leave this as rhetorical because we don't have time to address it directly, how do engineers avoid being mere calculators for others and become ethical decision makers and problem solvers? So on that, Steve, would you like to have some remarks in closing, and then Becky will have you pull it all together for us?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Bates. That was an excellent webinar. I really enjoyed the knowledge that you shared with us. I do have just a couple thoughts. I would like to encourage people, if they are looking for some specific examples, NAE did publish a few years back, Exemplars in Engineering Ethics Education. And that's an excellent report that's got some real specific assignments and real specific ideas for some professors that are new to engineering education. My final comment is I would really encourage yourself and your students to always think like an engineer. That's our That's our talent. That's what we bring to the team when we work with these diverse groups. I have known of some individuals to use as a debate tactic. Quit thinking like an engineer. I'm tired of hearing your arguments. And they've won the debate because if we turn off our engineering ability, then what do we bring to the team? We basically give up on our ethical standard that we're trying to promote. And so I think we can certainly remain engaged, understand diverse viewpoints, continue to be an engineer and to analyze situations as we're so trained to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
And I want to thank everybody who took an hour out of their time. It's been long days of Zoom meetings, and here's another one. So I appreciate that people have joined us to talk about this stuff that I think is really important and valuable to our community. So I would encourage people to try. I'd encourage people to look at the resources that are available to support trying these kinds of things, whether it's thinking about portfolio assessment and letting students choose their best evidence of their best work, or whether it's really including this idea of stories that can connect us to problems and each other.
Dr. Bates, Dr. Starrett, it's been wonderful. Thank you. And for those who are listening, you'll note in the Zoom chat, there's a recording from last time, which was Dr. Michael Louis talking about professionalism in engineering. This recording will also be made available shortly, certainly within the next week or so. And we will have another webinar coming up. Then that would be in, I think we're in May, early May. And that one is going to be on the subject of teaching engineering ethics in an international context. So please join our community if you're not already a member of the online ethics community. It'll give you access to resources and conversation. And we're thanking you for being here, and we'll see everyone next time. The last two questions are actually comments. Thank you, fantastic, great info, Becky. How will this link to the conference be communicated? We'll follow up with you. And think like an engineer, gracias, excelente webinar. Muy clara su dirección en inglés. Okay, take care. So long, everyone.